Welcome back, everybody, to A Foggy Day on Olympus. This is a place for grown-up discussions aimed at grown-up people.
Which is another way of saying that if you came here to get your opinions confirmed, you're in the wrong place.
Exactly. It is where we consider issues of history, religion, and culture, and why they matter. My name is Coel Campo.
And my name is Mike Pierce. And today, in the final episode of our short series on great 20th century writers too little read in the Anglosphere, we're looking at Vasily Grossman's novel Life and Fate,
Which has, in recent years, been persistently compared with Tolstoy's War and Peace.
Yes, that kind of important.
So clearly, his life and writings are set against the backdrop of World War II.
Yes, and more precisely against the backdrop of the monumental Battle of Stalingrad from late 1942 to early 1943, but more of that in a moment.
Right. Now, here we have a sort of a cute picture of him aged maybe about 8 with his mom. Did he have a happy upbringing?
Well, maybe not really. He was born in 1905 and his parents separated when he was 5 years old. And so he went with his mother from their hometown in Berdichev, which more in a moment, to live in Geneva in Switzerland for a couple of years. But then they returned in 1912. So although he remained in contact with his father, I suspect that the upbringing wasn't entirely happy, no. So here is a map showing where Grossman was born. He was born to a secular Jewish family in Berdichev in Ukraine, which was then part of the Russian Empire.
Right, so kind of like the author that we considered last week.
Yeah, whose perfectly simple name you struggled to pronounce.
Whose perfectly simple name I struggled to pronounce. Yeah, stop that.
Oh.
You got one in at me this time, I see.
Yes.
Mighty
Give me
proud
this
of
one-way
yourself.
trip. Yes.
Right, yes.
It'll have to last
Anyways.
you for months, I know.
Right. Well, it better. So, anyway, Grossman was a Ukrainian Jew, but this time born in the Russian Empire part of Ukraine, not the Austrian Empire part. And like with the other guy, this town too was overwhelmingly Jewish, right?
Right, it was. Perhaps therefore qualified also as a shtetl, a little Jewish town. But during Grossman's lifetime, it was hit with catastrophe. So let's just look at this mini chart here, showing the number of Jews in Berdichev and then in Ukraine in general, both before World War II and now. So in his hometown, there were 25 to 30,000 Jews before World War II. The overwhelming majority of them murdered in the war. Of course, it wasn't as small a number as about 25 or so, which it is now. After the war, loads of people who did survive left to America, to Israel, and so on. But they really are down to just a couple of dozen now. So 0.1% of what it was. And in Ukraine as a whole, and remember, the western part of Ukraine was Poland before the war, there were 2.7 million Jews. And nowadays we're talking about 32,000, so just over 1%, of whom one is the president, of course.
Right. So here we've got his family home, and it looks like the family was fairly well off. I mean, that house may not look like De Lampedusa's palazzo, but it's certainly pretty substantial.
Yes, and nowadays it's on Shevchenko Street, which I find kind of amusing. Everything's named after Taras Shevchenko in Ukraine these days. He was a great Ukrainian poet and promoter of the language back in the 19th century. I can't believe the street was called that back in 1905.
But there will be someone out there who knows differently and will let us know in the comments.
Inevitably. Yes. Okay, well, it's also the hometown of this man, Joseph Conrad, a very internationally famous novelist, Polish British. Well, he was a Pole from Berdichev. They were not the largest ethnic group there, maybe about the third largest after Jews and then Ukrainians. And he spent his early adult life wandering around all over the place, but ended up basically becoming a Brit. And many people will have heard of his novels like Lord Jim and Heart of Darkness. So there was that kind of legacy in the town.
But Conrad wasn't Jewish.
No, he was nominally a Catholic. In practice, he was actually an atheist, not a Jewish. Yes. Well, let's just take a little look through Grossman's biography, the chief points of it, in a couple of slides here. So, born then in Berdichev, which at the time of his birth had around 35,000 people, of whom perhaps 65%, two-thirds or so, were Jews, and which had 80 synagogues. As we've said, his parents separated in 1910, and Vasily went with his mother to Geneva for a couple of years, and then they moved back to Berdichev. And as a young man, he studied chemical engineering, which was his father's profession, at Moscow State University. If we do our math there, we'll realize that the Bolshevik Revolution broke out when he was just 12 years old. So by the time he gets to university student age, it's an established fact, and he supported the Soviet Revolution.
Right, but his father was pretty left wing too, wasn't he?
Yeah, his father had been a social democrat for a while, so he was pretty left wing, and Vasily seems to have picked up from his father. Yeah. He got married in 1928 and had a daughter, but via various complicated circumstances, the marriage dissolved 5 years later after his wife had several affairs. And he remarried a lady called Olga in 1936.
Now, his second marriage was the result of him having an affair.
Yes, it was really rather bad behavior on his part. He had an affair with his friend's wife. And not long after those two had then got divorced so that he could marry Olga, the former husband was arrested in the Stalinist purges on nonsensical charges as usual. And the authorities were actually then coming for Olga and imprisoned her. And he did two things which were really quite brave. Firstly, he quickly adopted the two children of that marriage to make sure that the children didn't get taken away into a state orphanage. And secondly, he wrote to the authorities urging them to release his wife, saying that she was now his wife, right, not Gruber's. And that could have landed him in serious trouble himself. But remarkably, the authorities complied. But that
Oh,
was quite a risky move and quite brave of him.
right.
Well, he was already a writer of short stories, really from his student days, and he was getting more and more well known. And in the mid 1930s, he gave up engineering to write full time. So that's pretty good for him, but we should remember that literature in the Soviet Union was very, very strictly controlled. If you didn't have government approval, you couldn't be published at all, and you needed to belong to the Writers' Union, which again required government approval. And basically, the only approved genre was so called socialist realism, which, as you can imagine, was generally pretty wooden and not terribly exciting. So, for a creative person, he was kind of restricted in terms of what he could write about. But his career really took off in 1941 when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and he became an extremely popular war reporter for Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, which was the army newspaper. He was present at most of the major battles of the Nazi-Soviet war. His mother was stuck in Berdichev, and he didn't know definitely about her death until 1944, but he'd given up hope long before because he was aware of the massacres that the Nazis were perpetrating.
Now, Grossman was racked with guilt about his mother's situation, right?
He was, because when the invasion started, his first instinct was to bring her to live with him and his wife in Moscow. And his wife insisted that the apartment was simply too small for the family as it was, plus one more person. So she remained where she was, and then she was simply cut off, and the Nazis moved in, and she, along with the vast majority of Jews in the town, was murdered. So that really played on his conscience. And that comes into his novel, Life and Fate, as we shall see in a few minutes. Well, he does a whole load of reporting on the Battle of Stalingrad, about which much more in a moment. But then, in the later stages of the war, he advanced with the advancing Soviet army as they pushed westwards. And his reports on the Treblinka extermination camp, called the Hell of Treblinka, were used as evidence by the prosecution at the Nuremberg trials.
So, the Nuremberg trial being the prosecution of the very worst Nazi criminals in late 1945 and 1946.
Yes, we can no longer just assume that people pick this fact up in their schooling as World War II retreats a little further into the rearview mirror. So, yeah, that was the case. I mean, one might think that thousands and thousands of people would have been put on trial. In fact, it was just a relatively small number of the very worst offenders. And only maybe, I can't remember the exact figure, it's about a dozen or maybe it's 15 people were actually hanged, and the others given very long prison sentences. But yeah, his writing was used in those trials. His work with Ilya Ehrenburg, who was another Soviet Jewish journalist, but also a historian, from late 1944 onwards, in compiling the Black Book of Soviet Jewry, documented war crimes against Soviet Jews. And it ended up being published in the US and elsewhere, but denounced as anti-Soviet by the Central Committee of the Communist Party and banned in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and this event shocked Grossman utterly. I mean, he may not have abandoned his socialist ideals, but he no longer had any illusions about the Soviet state.
Yeah, it was a big break in his life. Of course, he could hardly fail to be aware of how awful the Soviet system was, but perhaps like so many people, he thought that on balance it was better than the alternatives and that at least it would protect Jewish people like himself. And now he saw that that really was not the case. Well, it's worth considering for a moment why the Black Book was banned. And I would mention four main reasons. Firstly, Russian anti Semitism ran very, very deep. And in the last years of his life, that is in the early 1950s, Stalin would run a campaign against so-called rootless cosmopolitans, which was a code word for Jews in the Soviet Union. But that was always there. It had always been underlying everything. The Soviet line was that Holocaust crimes were, quote, against Soviet citizens. That is, their specifically anti-Jewish nature was not mentioned. Open discussion would reveal the complicity, even participation in the crimes by Russians and Ukrainians, etc.
So, saying that some Russians and Ukrainians actually sided with the Nazis.
Yeah, this is a huge subject, and we're just going to kind of like ding it here and move on. We have to remember that tens of millions of people had suffered terribly under communism, and millions had literally starved to death in Ukraine and elsewhere, but especially in Ukraine, in an absurd man made famine, the Holodomor, in the early 1930s. Anti Semitism was so widespread that Nazi hatred of Jews was hardly a stripe against them in the minds of many people, especially since Jews were so prominent in communist officialdom. So that was definitely a thing. But of course, that in itself was very hard for the communist authorities to own up to. It was easier just to denounce a few people as traitors and that kind of thing and just leave it at that. But a central line of communist discourse had always been to suppress national and especially religious distinctions between people. Only class differences were allowed to matter. Let's just remind ourselves of the final sentence of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto of almost 100 years before, right? Working people, the class definition of all nations, unite, right? So never mind your nationality or anything else. What matters is that you're working people. And that was very definitely still there.
Right.
Okay, well, just finally, then on the biography point, a lot of Grossman's later writing was banned or heavily censored. And he died of stomach cancer in 1964. Well, let's come now to Grossman's magnum opus, which was written, or at least finished, in 1959, and it's set against the vast Battle of Stalingrad, which took place between roughly August 1942 and February 1943.
Yeah, and when we say magnum opus, it's about 1,000 pages.
Yeah, it is. This is another reason for comparing it with War and Peace. It's just huge, right? It's not simply a qualitative judgment, that.
You know,
Well,
it's kind of amazing that the communists read the whole thing to find out whether they wanted to ban it or not.
I suspect, that they would have seen at a fairly early point, and the rest of it would have been simply confirmatory. But also by that stage, Grossman was no longer part of the naturally approved establishment. He was clearly drifting and had been since the whole hoo ha about the Black Book more than a decade earlier.
Right.
Yeah. Well, to summarize this vast novel in just a few little points here, it tells the story of a physicist, Victor Strum, and his family. Now, if the name looks suspiciously Jewish, and being a physicist is not so far from being a chemical engineer, I suppose, we might suspect that Strum is a kind of alter ego or stand in for the author himself. And indeed, that is the case, as we shall see. The novel has a whole load of plot lines. It's very complex and convoluted, but the most important concern Strum's family, the Battle of Stalingrad, and Soviet and Nazi prison camps. Now, on that last point, the equivalence Grossman makes between Nazi and Soviet oppression is an absolute red flag for the Soviet authorities, of course. There are depictions of Soviet anti Semitism, depictions of betrayals by ordinary people, including the central character, Strum. He writes a letter, or signs a letter rather, denouncing perfectly innocent people in order to make themselves safe or to advance their careers. There's the insistence in the novel by a Soviet propagandist that whole villages had starved themselves to death in the Holodomor in the early 1930s. And all of this made the novel completely unpublishable in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so this is where he's clearly going to get himself into some serious trouble with the authorities.
Yes, the equivalence thing, Grossman certainly wasn't going easy on the Nazis, far from it, but he was damning the Soviets too. Stalin had died in 1953, and after 1956, it was okay to criticize Stalin. But this was going too far, even for the less appalling regime of the late 1950s. They weren't going to stand for all of this. Well, let's pick up on one conversation that happens inside the novel and clearly would have been completely unacceptable to the authorities. But before we can get into that, we need to explain a bit about who this man was. He was the Soviet Lieutenant General Andrei Vlasov, and he was captured by the Nazis, and in August 1942, he was persuaded to change sides. And indeed, a whole load of Soviet prisoners of war were recruited into the Nazi armed forces. By the way, interesting side fact, around 20% of the soldiers captured by the British and Americans in Nazi uniform after D-Day in France were Soviet citizens.
Oh.
Now, some of them, of course, had been forced to do that or terrorized into it, but many others had done so for other reasons, which we'll consider in a moment. Well, here is General Andrei Vlasov inspecting soldiers of his Russian Liberation Army. One German official reported that, quote, his stated objective is to fight as Germany's ally for a socialist Russia and to rid his country of Stalin's system of terror.
So he was fighting against the Soviets, but he wanted a socialist Russia.
Yes, that's a pretty interesting fact. And it speaks to how the ideal of socialism was so tenacious in, let us say, the middle half, a generation either side of 1950 or so, amongst so many people. And it survived the fact that actual existing socialist societies were so awful or failures. People clung to it anyway as an ideal. And Vlasov is doing the same. So, yeah, just that.
Some people still clinging to it to this day.
Yes, they are. Although I would take the line, and this is taking us way off track here, but let's just follow it for one moment, that the vast majority of people in the West who talk the language of socialism don't mean it and don't even know what socialism is, right? I'm parodying here a little, but let's stick with it. Your typical British or American student or immediate post student who cries out for this. The very last thing in the world that they want is the ownership of the means of production by the state, with all of the shortages and the shoddy workmanship and the delays in delivery that would imply. What they mean is that they want Uncle Bernie to wave his magic wand and make their college debts go away, or something of the sort, right? And I'm not saying that those goals are necessarily wrong, but socialism, they are not.
Right. Right.
Almost nobody is now standing up for what socialism, actual socialism, means. But in the middle of the 20th century, this was very different. They were.
Right.
Okay, so Grossman depicts a conversation, a fictional conversation, but a very believable one, between Soviet soldiers who've been captured and are in the German prison camps. Okay, so Pavlyukov, who seemed a real son of the people with his wide nose and forehead, looked at the sentry pacing about his concrete tower and said, I've got no choice. I'll have to join up with Vlasov. Otherwise, it'll be the end of me. Is that your only reason? Asked Chernetsov. Is it just a matter of survival? I'm certainly not a kulak, said Pavlyukov. Kulaks were a made-up Soviet term. Well, it meant literally a fist, but it referred to a peasant who was richer than you were back at the time of collectivization of the farms in the early 1930s, right? So a demonized character in Soviet discourse. I'm certainly not one of them, said Pavlyukov, and I've never had to slave away in the camps felling trees, but I've got my own grudges against the communists. No, you mustn't sow that. No, you mustn't marry her. No, that's not your job. You end up turning into a parrot. Pavlyukov cast a sidelong glance at Chernetsov. 40 men from our barracks have already signed up. Why? For a bowl of soup and a warm greatcoat, and because they don't want to be worked to death, as many Soviet prisoners of the Germans were. Right, the survival rate was pretty low. Half or so, or even more than half, actually died in Nazi captivity. Death rates of German soldiers in Soviet captivity were even higher. Any other reasons? Some of them have ideological reasons. What exactly? Oh, various ones. The people killed in the camps, the poverty in the villages, they just can't stand communism. We might add to that, by the way, that plenty of people, especially non-Russians, might have had their own nationalisms as a consideration for signing up and fighting against the Soviet Union. No, said Chernetsov, that's not right. It's despicable. It's just not right, repeated Chernetsov. It's dishonourable. This is no time to settle scores, and it's the wrong way to go about it. You're not being fair to yourself or to your country. He stood up and rubbed his buttocks. No one could accuse me of sympathy for the Bolsheviks, he said, but believe me, now's not the time to settle accounts. Don't do it. Don't join Vlasov. In his excitement, he had begun to stammer. Listen to me, comrade, he repeated. Don't do it.
So he's making Chernetsov sound less than persuasive.
Yes, and Grossman's point is not that the prisoners were right to sign up with Vlasov. That would have been a suicidal assertion to make, whether in a novel or anywhere else. But what he is showing us is that those who did so made those decisions for understandable reasons. And of course, that in itself would have been completely unacceptable. After the war, Vlasov, of course, was executed, as were many of the surviving people who had fought for him in his Russian Liberation Army. Not that he was entrusted with any very serious responsibilities by the Germans anyway. Okay, here we've got a picture of Vlasov in the middle, underneath a couple of signs, one of them Nachrichtenblatt der Feldzeitung, so it's a newspaper for the army, and then Redakcja za Rodinu, a similar kind of sign in Russian. So here we've got a map.
So the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union had begun in June 1941, and this shows the situation starting about a year later.
Yes, up to this point, with the important exception of their failure to break into Moscow in December 41, the Nazis and their allies had carried all before them. They captured gigantic swathes of territory, knocked out masses of Soviet equipment, and captured literally millions of prisoners.
Who were their allies?
Well, on the Eastern Front, principally the Romanians, but the Italians sent a reasonable number of forces, and the Hungarians, although particularly the Hungarians were woefully equipped, and other regiments were raised from occupied countries. So there were, for example, French Nazis fighting. Spain was neutral in the war, but naturally tilted towards the Nazis, and loads of volunteers from Spain went there to fight. There were a whole ragbag. A number from the Croatian Ustash estate went along as well. But none of them were as well equipped as the Germans themselves. So we've got a whole slew of pictures here from the battle. Now, I just want to emphasize the size of this. If you add together the total number of British and American fatalities in the whole of World War II in all theatres, they would be greatly outnumbered by the number of fatalities in this one battle. It was gigantic, and it was the turning point of the war because the Germans lost it. And before then, almost always they had been advancing, and after that, they were in retreat. So here's a whole bunch of pictures. This showing German tanks advancing towards Stalingrad in August 42. And here we have some German soldiers on the banks of the Volga and waiting for orders to attack the city. More German soldiers outside Stalingrad. And again. And again. This shows some of the 220,000 Romanian soldiers that took part in the battle. Another one of some more Germans. And this, by the late autumn, shows the pressure starting to tell on some of the German forces. So this guy here is no longer the clean-cut, neat warrior of an invincible army. He looks like a worried man.
Yet no longer so clean cut and neat. What are we saying here?
Well, the spaces in the Soviet Union were vast, and they'd been stretched out into huge swathes of territory. And even with their allies, they were at their limits. So they'd gone about as far as they can go. They were taking on huge enemies, even though the Soviet forces were qualitatively far inferior. Their sheer numbers were starting to tell. And the Soviets were starting to be equipped by the Americans, who had a vast industrial machine, sending in tanks and planes and armored cars and vehicles and so on, which the Germans simply couldn't compete with. They couldn't destroy them fast enough. So now the wheels are starting to come off and everything's getting way harder for them than it had been up to this point in the war.
So, would you say that their downfall was that just that they got too ambitious and stretched themselves too thin?
Yes. I mean, essentially, they'd taken on not the whole world quite, but certainly all of the rest of the industrialized world. And that made it pretty impossible for them to win. Their other big problem was that they desperately needed oil. All they had through an alliance with Romania was access to the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, which were limited, at least for the demands of war, and their ability to create synthetic oil. But they needed to get through to oil fields. That was why they were so desperate to push through the British in Egypt and get through to, Iraq and the oil fields of the Middle East. And that didn't work. So plan B was to push down through the Caucasus to get to Baku and Azerbaijan, and you've got unlimited supplies of oil there. And that was why Stalingrad really mattered to them. And they failed. And after that, well, their war machine is running on a fraction of what it needs simply in terms of oil, quite apart from anything else. So, yes. So, a lot of fighting happens in this vast Red October factory in Stalingrad. So, if the battle was the turning point of the war, maybe the fighting in this factory was the turning point in that battle.
So, there were major battles going on literally inside this vast factory?
Yes, yes, incessantly. I mean, the whole city was basically reduced to rubble, and people were fighting over piles of rubble and what was left of buildings and what have you. Now, here we've got a Soviet poster telling soldiers to fight to the death, as indeed they more or less had to do, because behind frontline troops were NKVD blocking groups. The NKVD were like the Soviet secret police, but they had their own troops as well. Blocking groups whose job was to shoot anyone who fell back. And 13,000 were killed in this way in Stalingrad alone. It's just mind-numbing.
Yeah, it sounds like something similar that we've been seeing more recently.
Yes, regardless of casualties, just use numbers to overwhelm and push on through. Yes. But you can imagine, as the Germans did eventually start to lose this battle, how unwilling they were to surrender, because if the Soviets treat their own soldiers like this, how are they going to treat prisoners? And in that judgment, they would not have been wrong.
And that kind of escalates the whole uh, conflict since nobody can really back down.
Right, right. Well, neither the Nazis nor the Soviet Union were signatories to the Geneva Convention. And that meant the fighting between them was no holds barred. Now, despite that fact, with numerous notable horror stories, the Germans did actually treat Western Allied troops whom they captured decently. But then they knew that if they did anything else, not only would it be known by governments who actually cared about them, which was not the case with the Soviets, but that then maybe German prisoners would be treated badly as well. But on the Eastern Front, none of that stuff applied. It was absolutely ruthless. Yes. Well, here we've got German soldiers in destroyed buildings. I think that might even be the Red October factory. And here. And this is what the Germans call Rattenkrieg, rat war, fighting inside and between buildings at very close quarters. So heart-stopping stuff. And again, here and here. And here we've got fighting going on in the nightmare hellscape that Stalingrad had become. Some Soviet machine gunners. And this is a decisive moment in the battle. The Germans were already, as it were, running out of breath in this conflict. And in late November, the Soviets managed to drive loads of their own forces across the river, either side of the Germans, and cut them off so that the besiegers are now themselves besieged. And it's the end of the Sixth Army, really. What's left there is in the Kessel, in the yellow area, the so-called Kessel or Cauldron, and it was just 11 weeks until the final surrender. At first, they could just about be resupplied, but only by air. And then when the last airstrip was captured, there wasn't anything that could be done. Just stuff flown over and dropped. And then after that, even those were stopped. And the army was basically doomed.
So the German army had already reached what military wonks call its culmination point, and now they're surrounded and cut off from supplies and reinforcements.
Right, yes. And there's no rescuing them from that point, and Hitler forbade them to surrender. Well, by late November, a lot of Germans were exhausted and starving and traumatized and desperate, as you can see on these faces.
Yeah, those faces are what war journalists call the 1,000-yard stare.
Yes, it comes about when soldiers have been in intense conflict and needing to keep looking at exactly where the enemy might be coming from for many hours or days or weeks on end. I've seen similar pictures of Australians also in the Second World War in New Guinea with the same effect on their faces. And actually, another picture I'm thinking of some British commandos in Afghanistan from just a few years ago, the 1,000-yard stare. Yeah, it goes, it doesn't stay forever, but it looks really horrible. And it's a, kind of an expression of trauma. Yes. Well, here we've got some Soviet soldiers in Stalingrad, and here's some Germans. Here are Soviets grinding the Germans down, fighting in camouflage as winter arrives in January 1943. The German resistance is getting feebler and feebler. Here's a German looking in a terrible state. And here's snow on the ruins in Stalingrad. And here are some German soldiers surrendering in February 1943, basically starving.
They look like they're in a terrible state.
Yeah, terrible cold, no food, no hope of supply or rescue. I mean, the contrast with the way they had appeared earlier in the war could not be more graphic.
You almost want to feel sorry for them.
Yes, yes. Well, here are captured Germans being led away after Stalingrad, and here's a huge line of them snaking into the distance. 96,000 survivors of the once 300,000 strong army, Sixth Army, were captured. But of those, only about 5,000 lived to return to Germany after the war. So that's what, a 1 in 60 survival rate. And they didn't return to Germany until 1955, by the way. When the war came to an end, the British released their prisoners in November 45. The Americans in, I'm not sure if it's March or April, spring 46 anyway. And the Soviets in 1955, where they were kept in really harsh conditions, often working to repair devastated Soviet cities or simply kept in labor camps. Yeah.
It's hard to choose which side you want to root for.
Well, yeah. They were both completely terrible. And of course, this was, in a way, the point of Grossman's novel, right? That both of them were appalling totalitarian states. Here are Germans being paraded through the streets of Moscow, which itself was against the Geneva Convention, of course, but that didn't apply. And perhaps the best account of the Battle of Stalingrad is this 1998 bestseller, which is still in print, by Anthony Beevor. He's one of the most important military historians, just called Stalingrad.
I'm guessing that's a pretty grim read.
You are guessing correctly. Yeah, it is. That and his book about the downfall, the fall of Berlin in 1945, which is possibly even worse. But I mean, the fighting was just terrible, terrible, terrible. Well, here we come to another extract from Grossman's novel, and it's a letter written by Anna Semyonova, the mother imprisoned in the Berdichev ghetto of the novel's central character, Victor Strum, to her son. And of course, if Victor Strum really is the author's alter ego, his own mother had been killed in the Berdichev ghetto. So this is perhaps the letter that he imagines his mother might have written to him. Well, this is just an excerpt from it anyway. Now at night, Vitya, I am seized by terror, from which my heart freezes. Death is waiting for me. I want to call you for help. As a child, you would run to me, seeking protection. And now, in a moment of weakness, I want to hide my head in your lap, so that you, smart and strong, would shield and defend it. I do not possess the strength of character, Victor, as I am weak. I often think about suicide. And then, the sadder a man is, and the less he hopes to survive, the more generous, kind, and good he is. The poor, the tinkers, the tailors, all doomed to death, are much nobler, gentler, and wiser than those who've managed to stock up some food. Young teachers, a strange old teacher, and chess player Spielberg, quiet librarians, an engineer Revich, who is as helpless as a child, but who wants to equip the ghetto with homemade grenades. What wonderful, impractical, nice, sad, and kind people they are.
Now, this, especially the second paragraph, really reflects the central message of the novel.
Yes, this is the kind of philosophy of life that he wants to convey. That the people who feel in control of everything are not necessarily very kind, but those who know that they can do nothing, they are. Well, here's a picture of Grossman, still a war reporter in Schwerin in Germany in 1945. He moved with the Soviet army as they advanced westwards and did terrible things in eastern Germany, but he was with them. And here he is by the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin at the end of the war. Of course, it's completely shot up, as was the whole of the city. When he writes this up in his later years, in the late 1950s, he gets, as we've said, into trouble with the authorities. He submitted the manuscript for publication in the fall of 1960. And immediately his apartment was raided by the KGB, as it was by then called, who took all manuscripts, copies, notebooks, and even typewriter ribbons. But Grossman had given 2 manuscript copies to friends.
So he'd probably guessed that sort of thing was likely to happen.
Yes, he had. 21 months later, he was informed that his book could not be published for several centuries, that it would do even greater harm to the Soviet Union than Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago.
Right, and Zhivago had been an enormous success in the West.
Yes, it had. And we should say something about that now. Here is Pasternak, born in 1890, dies in 1960, major Russian poet, but he's best known not simply for his poetry, he was famous for that, but even more for his novel, Dr. Zhivago, which was completed in 1955 but rejected for publication. So it has a similar kind of story to its publication as Grossman's Life and Fate, except that success for Dr. Zhivago came much, much earlier. A manuscript was smuggled out by an Italian communist and published in Italian in November 1957 and caused an instant sensation. And an English translation appeared, what's that, about 9 months later, something like that, 10 months later, in August 58, and it topped the New York Times bestseller list for 26 weeks. The novel was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1958, which Pasternak was forbidden to travel to accept, and it became a movie in 1963. And I have to say that I saw it maybe not immediately, but not that long after it came out, and was stunned by it. And I've seen it 3 or 4 times more recently, and it remains, I think, the best movie I have ever seen, even though they took some liberties with the plot. Almost inevitably, really, I suppose.
Right. Now, Pasternak had only just avoided being killed during the purges of the late 1930s.
Yeah, he had. I think his name was on a list to be sent to the camps, and Stalin had written on it something like, "Oh, leave this dreamer alone," something like that. Thinking he's relatively harmless. But he was disapproved of because he clearly did not write in the mold of socialist realism. There are several lines in the novel that come up in the movie, actually, where the communists are always saying the personal life is dead in Russia. History has taken over, with its iron laws, as Karl Marx would have seen it. And that was the opposite of everything that Pasternak wanted to say. He wanted to say that the personal life mattered. But in a totalitarian society, having a personal life is suspect. The regime is not everything to you. You're opting out at some level. So, yeah, he was considered suspect for all of this and for other reasons. Yeah.
And he was partly of Jewish ancestry himself.
Yes, he was, although he certainly wouldn't have identified as Jewish. They were back, a generation or two before. And later in his life, he started attending the Orthodox Church, which would also have been disapproved of by the authorities. So he's not only advocating personal autonomy and cultivating a personal life, but being religious to boot. So, yes. Okay, well, back with Grossman. Grossman then, in his difficulties, appealed to Khrushchev personally. He apparently was not aware that Khrushchev detested him. And it wasn't until 1974, 10 years after Grossman's death, that one of the friends to whom he'd sent those manuscripts made a microfilm of it, smuggled it out of the USSR. And it wasn't until 6 years after that that it was finally published in French. And then 8 years later in Russia and in the Russian language during the final years of the Soviet Union, when under Gorbachev, glasnost, openness had taken over and it could appear.
So he must have died thinking that nobody would ever see it.
Yes, that must have been the case. Whereas even though Pasternak had died earlier in 1960, he already knew that his novel was a smash hit and that it was going to be published in multiple languages and it was just a matter of time. In fact, if I remember correctly, I think the CIA paid for a translation into Russian or a print run into Russian and distributed it minus book covers to Soviets at world trade fairs in, I think it was in the Netherlands somewhere. And so basically went up to the nearest Soviet and just handed them a copy of this book. Here's a present on us. And printed copies made their way back into the Soviet Union in Russian.
Those rascals.
Incredible stuff, yes. Okay, well, here we've got a picture of Grossman. It's a pretty good picture, but I'm guessing it's from the late 1940s when he's still well accepted by the party, the wrinkle over the black book notwithstanding. He's looking very uncomfortable in a suit there, but his hero status as a war reporter made him, for a little while at least, part of the literary establishment. We should also mention Grossman's last novel, Everything Flows, which is a normal length. I don't know the number of pages, but it's about 250, something like that, a fraction of the monstrosity that is Life and Fate. And he wrote it at a point where he no longer cared about staying on the right side of the authorities. He had already burned his bridges as far as that was concerned. And the central character of Everything Flows is someone called Ivan Grigorievich, who has just been released after 30 years in Soviet camps, as many people were after the fall of Stalin. And in the novel, we meet those who informed on him, and we meet his lover, Anna, who played an enthusiastic role in the Holodomor in the 1930s, in which millions of people starved to death. So again, it's holding up the Soviets' dirty linen in public, as it were, in this novel. And finally, we should mention these biographies of Vasily Grossman. I have the one on the left here, but there are three biographies, certainly that I know about. One of them co-written by Anthony Beevy, you will note. And my understanding is that they are all pretty good.
So this is the bit where we shake out the last few remaining cents from our viewers' pockets.
It's the least we can do for them, really.
Such a favor that we're doing for you.
Yeah.
Actually, probably for Jeff Bezos, if you think about it.
Yeah.
So anyway, now next week we're going to be starting a brand new series.
Yes, after several requests to make a series on Balkan history, we're making at least a gesture in that direction. And we're calling it 20th Century Balkans, a tragedy in 5 acts, which is, as the title implies, restricted to modern times.
Yes, and we're defining Balkans in our own way.
Yes, however incorrectly, we're defining it as the territories of what was, for much of the time, Yugoslavia and nothing else. Otherwise, we'd need to run to a much longer series.
Right, and we're bound to offend somebody in the process.
Absolutely guaranteed. Yes, we're bracing ourselves for toxic comments from multiple different directions, but we'll say something about that at the time. Yes.
Right. Well, I think this was a bit of a grim episode in some spots, but important nonetheless. Hopefully, you'll pick up some new reading material and hopefully you enjoyed watching. And so, in exchange, we would kindly ask you to repost to social media so that we can become rich and famous and read more books or something like that.
Yeah, that's basically the plan here. So yes, please, in all seriousness, please do that, people. It will help us enormously if you just post a link to this episode or some other episode you particularly enjoyed onto your social media account, recommend it, or just recommend it to other people in conversation and so on. Yes, but we'll look forward to seeing you all again for a brand new series starting next week. Thank you, everybody, and bye bye now.
Bye, everyone.